Dr. Richard Morrow wasn't a man easily shaken. As a seasoned psychiatrist with over 20 years of experience, he had seen his share of disturbed minds. The erratic, the delusional, the downright dangerous, they were his bread and butter. But when the call came from Father Michael, a local priest known for his calm demeanor, there was something in the man's voice that sent a shiver down Richard's spine. "It's unlike anything I've seen before, Doctor," Father Michael said, his words halting. "I believe this man is possessed." Richard didn't believe in possessions, demons, or the devil himself. He was a man of science, grounded in the tangible. But Father Michael's plea had an urgency he couldn't ignore. The patient was a 29-year-old man named Jared Hill, a mechanic from a nearby town. His family claimed he had started speaking in languages he didn't know, convulsing at night and muttering blasphemies under his breath. But what really worried them, and the priest, were the blackouts. Jared would wake up in strange places covered in scratches he couldn't explain. And the violence. His wife had a fractured wrist to prove it. Richard's office was sterile but inviting. Leather armchairs, bookshelves lined with psychology tomes, a faint smell of eucalyptus from the diffuser. When Jared walked in, he looked like any other patient. Pale, tired, maybe a little on edge, but nothing about him screamed, possessed. "So, Jared," Richard began, tapping his pen on the notepad, "tell me what's been going on." Jared's voice was soft, almost apologetic. "It's hard to explain. It's like I'm not alone in my head. Sometimes I black out, and when I come to, I've done things, bad things." "Can you give me an example?" Jared hesitated, then leaned in closer, his eyes wide and glassy. "Last week I woke up in the woods, standing over a dead deer. I was holding a knife. I don't even hunt." Richard scribbled a note but kept his expression neutral. "And these blackouts, do they always feel the same? Like something's taking over?" Jared nodded slowly. "It's like someone else is driving, and I'm just watching." The second session was when things took a darker turn. Jared arrived late, his shirt damp with sweat. He seemed agitated, his hands twitching as if they had a mind of their own. "Bad night?" Richard asked, his voice calm. Jared didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, a crooked smile spreading across his face. "You don't believe, do you?" The voice that came out wasn't Jared's. It was guttural, deep, like gravel grinding against steel. Richard froze. "Jared, are you feeling okay?" The man laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound. "He doesn't know, does he? Poor little doctor, playing with fire." The lights in the office flickered. Richard's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Jared, if this is some kind of act, it's not funny." Jared slammed his fist on the desk, his eyes rolling back until only the whites were visible. He began to speak in a rapid, unfamiliar language, his voice echoing unnaturally in the small room. Shaken, Richard decided to dig deeper. He contacted Jared's family and learned that the incidents had started after Jared had purchased an antique mirror from an estate sale. The mirror, they said, had a strange aura about it. A psychic, a friend of the family, claimed it was a portal for malevolent entities. Skeptical but intrigued, Richard asked Jared to bring the mirror to their next session. When it arrived, the mirror was unassuming, a rectangular frame with tarnished edges. But the moment it entered the office, the air grew heavy. Jared stared at it with a mix of fear and reverence. "It whispers," he said. "At night, it whispers things I don't want to hear." That evening, Richard stayed late in his office, the mirror propped against the wall. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something compelled him to stay. At midnight, the temperature dropped. Richard's breath fogged the air. Then, faintly at first, he heard it. A whisper, soft and seductive. "Richard," it cooed, "come closer." Against his better judgment, he approached the mirror. His reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. The eyes were darker, the smile crueler. "Let me in," the reflection hissed. Richard stumbled back, breaking the spell. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a symphony of dread. The mirror began to vibrate, the glass rippling as if it were liquid. and then it shattered. When Richard came to, he was lying on the floor, shards of glass embedded in his hands. Jared was gone, and so was the mirror. A week later, Richard learned that Jared had been found dead in his home, his body contorted unnaturally. The police ruled it a suicide, but Richard knew better. Epilogue. Now, years later, Richard's once steady hands tremble as he writes his account. The mirror still haunts his dreams, its whispers echoing in the dark corners of his mind. He doesn't know where it is, or who it might have found next, but one thing is certain: the devil doesn't need permission, he only needs an invitation. Dr. Elias Grant was no stranger to the complexities of the human mind. In his 25 years as a psychiatrist, he had encountered every shade of mental illness, every layer of trauma. He prided himself on his ability to see through the fog of madness and find the human soul beneath. That was until he met Victor Carlisle. Victor was brought to Elias's clinic on a gray Tuesday afternoon, escorted by 2 officers from the sheriff's department. His wrists were bound with cuffs, his hands smeared with what Elias initially thought was mud. Later, he would learn it wasn't mud at all. Victor Carlisle, age 33. Charges include assault, battery, and suspected homicide, one officer said as he handed over the intake paperwork. "Good luck with this one, Doc. He's off." The officer tapped the side of his head for emphasis. Elias wasn't one to be swayed by theatrics. He had dealt with violent patients before, men and women who lashed out in the throes of psychosis or despair. But when Victor was led into the room, Elias felt an involuntary tightening in his chest. There was something in Victor's eyes. Not fear, not anger, something darker. Victor sat down heavily in the chair across from Elias, his posture slumped, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes, though, they were alive, darting around the room as if tracking something no one else could see. "Mr. Carlisle," Elias began, his tone even, "can you tell me what happened?" Victor's gaze snapped to him, and for a moment, Elias felt like prey under a predator's scrutiny. Then Victor smiled, a thin, humorless curve of the lips. "It's not what I did," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's what he made me do." Elias leaned forward, pen poised over his notebook. "Who made you do it?" Victor chuckled, a sound that crawled under Elias's skin. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." Victor's smile faltered, and his expression grew serious. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "The devil." Elias had heard variations of this before: delusions of grandeur, religious mania, dissociative states. He nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Tell me more." Victor's hands twitched on the table, his fingers curling and uncurling like claws. "It started with the dreams," he said. "Him standing at the foot of my bed, tall, shadows where his face should be. He didn't speak at first, just watched. Then one night he leaned down and whispered in my ear, said he could make me powerful, make me whole." Elias felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine. He didn't believe in the supernatural, but Victor's voice carried a conviction that was hard to dismiss. "What did he ask for in return?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. Victor's eyes darkened. "Nothing at first. He just watched. But then, things started happening. My hands, they weren't mine anymore. I'd wake up holding things, knives, ropes, bottles of gasoline. And people were hurt." Elias felt the room grow colder, though he couldn't say why. "Victor, do you remember hurting anyone?" Victor shook his head violently. "No, it wasn't me. I swear to God, it wasn't me. I'd black out, and when I'd wake up, there'd be blood. Sometimes it was mine. Sometimes it wasn't." The lights in the room flickered, and Elias's pen slipped from his hand. He reached down to pick it up, but when he straightened, Victor's face had changed. His eyes were impossibly black, the whites consumed by darkness. His mouth stretched into a grin too wide for his face. "You think you can help him?" The voice wasn't Victor's. It was deeper, layered, almost mechanical. "He's mine." Elias's breath caught in his throat. "Victor?" The thing wearing Victor's face laughed, a sound that seemed to echo inside Elias's skull. "Victor's not here right now, but don't worry, Doc. He'll be back when I'm done with him." The lights flickered again, and Victor slumped forward, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. When he lifted it again, his eyes were back to normal, though they were filled with tears. "Help me," Victor whispered. "Please, God, help me." Elias's hands trembled as he reached for the call button on his desk. He didn't believe in demons, but he also couldn't deny what he had just seen. He arranged for Victor to be transferred to a secure psychiatric facility, but the experience stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. A week later, Elias received a package at his home. Inside was a single item, a blood-stained mirror. There was no note, no return address. Just the mirror and his own reflection staring back at him, with eyes that weren't his. Dr. Julian Hart didn't choose psychiatry, it chose him. After losing his brother to suicide in their teens, Julian dedicated his life to understanding the fractures of the human mind. By the time he was in his 50s, his name was whispered with reverence in psychiatric circles. If anyone could fix the broken, it was Julian Hart. But there was one case, his last, that he wished he'd turned away. It started on a muggy August afternoon. Julian was wrapping up paperwork when his assistant knocked hesitantly. "There's a man here to see you," she said. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he seems desperate." Julian sighed, already feeling the weight of the day on his shoulders. "Send him in." The man who entered was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. He carried the scent of cigarettes and something metallic, like rust. He didn't sit when Julian gestured to the chair, just stood, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "My name's Matthew," he said, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "I need help, Doc. I'm not myself anymore." Julian's instinct was to offer calm reassurance, but there was something in Matthew's eyes, a flicker, a shadow that moved too fast to catch. "Tell me what's going on," Julian said, picking up his pen. Matthew began to pace. "It started 6 months ago. I was working construction out in the desert. We were clearing land and we found this thing, an old box buried deep. It had markings on it, symbols. I told the crew we should leave it alone, but they laughed, said it was probably just some junk from a ghost town." "What happened to the box?" Julian asked. Matthew stopped pacing and looked directly at Julian. "We opened it. Inside was a doll carved from wood, with nails driven into its eyes. It didn't seem like much, but after that, things started happening. Weird things. The crew got sick. One guy fell off a scaffold and broke his neck. Then one night, I heard something whispering my name." Julian felt a chill creep up his spine. He had heard his share of delusions, but this was different. Matthew wasn't just recounting a story, he was reliving it. "I started blacking out," Matthew continued, his voice trembling. "I'd wake up in strange places, covered in scratches. People began avoiding me. My wife left with the kids. She said my face wasn't mine anymore." Julian leaned forward. "What do you mean by that?" Matthew's eyes darkened. "Sometimes when I look in the mirror, it's not me staring back. It's him." "Him?" Matthew opened his mouth to speak, but instead a guttural growl emerged. His body convulsed and he dropped to the floor, his limbs jerking violently. Julian rushed to his side, but as he reached out, Matthew's head snapped up. His eyes weren't human anymore. They were black as pitch, endless voids that seemed to pull Julian in. "He's here," Matthew rasped, his voice layered, as if two people were speaking at once. "He sees you." Julian stumbled back, his pulse racing. "Matthew, you're having a psychotic episode. You need medical attention." Matthew's laughter was low and hollow, reverberating unnaturally. "You think you can fix this with pills, doctor? He's in me. And now he's watching you." The air in the room grew thick, oppressive. The fluorescent light above them flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Julian tried to shake it off as a power surge, but deep down he knew better. Matthew collapsed into unconsciousness, his body limp. When the paramedics arrived, Julian gave them a hurried explanation of a severe seizure. He didn't mention the eyes, the voice, or the strange cold that lingered in the room long after Matthew was gone. But the encounter didn't end there. That night, Julian sat in his study, replaying the session in his mind. The shadows in the room seemed deeper than usual, the silence too loud. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and tried to focus on the stack of patient files in front of him. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. "Julian." His head snapped up. The room was empty. He shook his head and took another sip of whiskey. "You're imagining things," he muttered. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Julian." The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside his head, crawling through his thoughts like a parasite. Julian stood, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. The shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into a figure. A tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes that burned like embers. "You opened the door," the figure said, its voice the same layered rasp Julian had heard from Matthew. "And now I'm here." Julian tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure stepped closer, and Julian felt an icy grip around his chest. The next morning, his assistant found him in his study, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't respond to her voice, didn't blink. Julian Hart was gone, his body nothing more than an empty vessel. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread about the once brilliant psychiatrist who had succumbed to madness. But there were those who believed he wasn't mad at all. They spoke of an ancient evil, released by a foolhardy act, now wandering the earth in search of new doors to open. And if you ever feel a cold whisper in your ear, calling your name in the dead of night, you might want to think twice before answering. Dr. Evelyn Price was not your average psychiatrist. With a reputation for handling the toughest cases, criminals, psychotics, and the criminally insane, she thrived in the darkest corners of the human mind. Her colleagues called her fearless, but she'd laugh and say it wasn't bravery, it was curiosity. That curiosity led her to room 317 at St. Vincent's Psychiatric Facility, the locked ward where patients were sent when they weren't fit for society or for other hospitals. The patient's file was slim. His name was Daniel Harker, age 29, former theology student, no family contact. Arrested after a brutal assault on his landlord. The landlord survived but was left blinded and unable to speak. Daniel claimed he had no memory of the attack. The officers who arrested him described his behavior as inhuman. Evelyn didn't believe in inhuman behavior. She believed in trauma, mental illness, and unhealed wounds. When she entered the room, Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, his back to the door. The overhead light flickered, typical for the old wing of the hospital. Evelyn made a mental note to report it. "Daniel Harker?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. He didn't respond, but she noticed his shoulders tense. "Mr. Harker, my name is Dr. Price. I'm here to help you." Daniel turned his head slightly, just enough for Evelyn to catch the side of his face. He looked younger than she'd expected, his skin pale but unmarred. His eyes, however, were a different story. Bloodshot, sunken, and filled with something wrong. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low and strained. "I think you might feel better if we talked about what happened," Evelyn replied, taking a seat in the chair by the door. "Why don't you start with how you ended up here?" Daniel laughed, a hollow sound that made her skin prickle. He finally turned to face her, and she caught her breath. His pupils were dilated, nearly swallowing the irises. "It wasn't me," he said. "I told them. I told everyone. It wasn't me." Evelyn nodded. "The assault on your landlord. You don't remember it?" Daniel shook his head violently. "I remember. The voice." "What voice?" Daniel's breathing quickened, and he gripped the sides of his head. "It started at night. A whisper, soft at first. It called my name, over and over. Then it told me things. Terrible things." "What kind of things?" Evelyn pressed, her tone gentle. Daniel's gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, she felt something heavy press down on her chest. "It said I was chosen. that it had a plan for me, but I didn't want it. I swear, I didn't want it. Evelyn scribbled notes, her clinical mind parsing his words. Auditory hallucinations, possibly schizophrenia. Did the voice tell you to hurt your landlord? Daniel's face crumpled. I told it to stop. I prayed, I begged, but then, it wasn't just a voice anymore. What do you mean? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. It showed itself. It crawled out of the mirror. It looked like me, but its eyes. He broke off, trembling. It said if I didn't do what it wanted, it would take everything. It made me watch. Watch what? Evelyn asked, though her pulse was racing. What it did to him, Daniel said, his voice breaking. It laughed while it hurt him. I was screaming, but no one heard. No one ever hears. The room grew colder, the flickering light dimming as if the shadows themselves were thickening. Evelyn glanced at the bulb but forced herself to focus. Daniel, sometimes trauma can make our minds. Don't, he snapped, his voice deeper now. It almost didn't sound like him. Don't talk to me like I'm crazy. You don't know what it's like to have it inside you. Evelyn's pen stilled. Inside you? Daniel grabbed the front of his shirt, his fingers clawing at the fabric as if trying to rip something out. It's still here, he growled. It's always here, watching, waiting. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but then the temperature in the room dropped again. This time it wasn't subtle. Her breath puffed in the air, a misty cloud that shouldn't have been possible in August. Daniel, I think we should take a break. He let out a strangled cry, falling to his knees. His body convulsed, his hands slamming against the floor. Evelyn jumped to her feet, reaching for the panic button by the door, but froze when Daniel looked up. His eyes weren't his anymore. They were black, endless pits of darkness. Do you feel it, doctor? The voice wasn't Daniel's. It was guttural, layered, and inhuman. Do you feel me watching you? Evelyn backed away, her mind screaming to run, to get out, but her feet wouldn't move. The shadows in the room twisted, slithering up the walls like living things. You came here to help him, the voice mocked. But you can't even save yourself. Daniel, Evelyn whispered, trying to reach him. You're stronger than this. Fight it. Daniel's body spasmed again, and for a brief moment, his eyes returned to normal. Tears streamed down his face as he choked out, Please, help me. Before Evelyn could respond, his head snapped back, and his body went limp. The shadows receded, and the light stopped flickering. The room was silent. Paramedics declared Daniel dead on arrival. Officially, the cause was a cardiac arrest induced by a psychotic episode. Evelyn didn't argue. What could she say? That she'd seen the devil in his eyes. That the cold she felt still clung to her like a second skin. That night back in her apartment, Evelyn stared at her bathroom mirror. Her reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. But just as she turned away, she saw it. Just for a second, a flicker of black in her own eyes. The whispers started that night. Dr. Charles Keene didn't believe in the supernatural. He believed in hard science, in the malfunctions of the brain that could make a man hear voices or believe he was the reincarnation of Napoleon. The devil, he often told his colleagues, is just a metaphor for the darkest corners of the human psyche. That's why the case of Leah Whitaker shook him to his core. It began with a call from an old colleague, Dr. Emily Voss, who ran a small psychiatric hospital in upstate New York. She sounded frazzled, something Charles had never heard before. Charles, I have a patient I need you to consult on. It's complicated. Complicated how? He asked, already regretting the conversation. Just come. You have to see her. Leah was 24, with stringy blonde hair and a gaunt face that seemed much older. She was restrained to the bed, not because she was violent, Emily assured him, but because she had a habit of clawing at her own skin. Her arms were covered in red, angry scars. When Charles entered the room, Leah's head turned sharply, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him hesitate. "Who's this?" she rasped. Her voice was low, gravelly, like someone who'd smoked for 50 years. "This is Dr. Keene," Emily said gently. "He's here to help you, Leah." Leah smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you'd see on someone who already knew the punchline to a joke you didn't want to hear. "You can't help me," she said, her voice dipping into a sing-song mockery. "None of you can." Charles took a seat by the bed, his notebook balanced on his knee. "Why don't you tell me why you're here, Leah?" She chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Because I signed the wrong contract." Charles raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Leah's gaze flicked to Emily, then back to him. "She didn't tell you, did she? Typical. Nobody wants to admit what's really going on." "Why don't you tell me then?" Charles pressed, his voice calm. Leah leaned forward as far as her restraints would allow. "You don't want to know. But if you're really that curious..." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "I was desperate. My mom was dying of cancer. I just lost my job. I didn't have anyone else to turn to." "So what did you do?" Leah smiled again, that same unnerving grin. "I prayed, but God didn't answer." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Charles felt a chill creep up his spine, but he ignored it. "So who answered?" Her smile widened. "You already know, don't you? He calls himself a lot of things, but you'd probably call him the devil." Emily shifted uncomfortably behind Charles, but he kept his focus on Leah. "And what did the devil want in return?" he asked, his pen hovering over the page. Her expression darkened. "Just my signature. Easy, right? One little signature, and my mom would live. I'd get my job back. Everything would be fine." Charles frowned. "You're saying you made a deal with the devil?" Leah barked out a laugh. "I didn't think it was real. It was just some stupid ritual I found online. I lit the candles, said the words, and signed the paper. That's when it started." "What started?" "The whispers," Leah said, her voice dropping to a whisper of its own. "They followed me everywhere, telling me to do things, horrible things." Charles leaned back in his chair, trying to keep his skepticism from showing. "And did you?" Leah's eyes glistened with tears, but her grin remained. "Oh, I tried not to. I fought it. But he's persistent. When he wants something, he gets it. That's why I'm here, Doc. I'm just a puppet now." Before Charles could respond, Leah's body convulsed violently, her head snapping back against the pillow. Emily rushed forward, but Leah's voice, low, guttural, and not her own, froze her in her tracks. "You shouldn't have come here, Charles Keene." The voice sent a jolt through Charles. It wasn't just Leah's voice. It sounded like a chorus, 1,000 voices layered into one. "Leah?" Charles said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. Her head turned toward him, but it wasn't Leah anymore. Her eyes were black, her mouth twisted into a snarl. "She's mine," the voice growled. "And now, so are you." The lights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. Charles felt an invisible weight pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. "Emily, get out," he said, his voice tight. "But get out." Emily hesitated for a moment before fleeing the room. Charles turned back to Leah, or whatever was now controlling her. "What do you want?" he demanded. The thing laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally. "Want? I already have everything I want. But you're interesting. So confident. So sure of yourself." Charles's hands clenched into fists. "Let her go." The thing tilted Leah's head, as if considering him. "She's already gone, but don't worry, Doctor. She's just the beginning." With that, Leah's body went limp, her head lolling to the side. The lights steadied, and the oppressive weight lifted. But Charles knew it wasn't over. Leah was pronounced dead that night, her cause of death listed as cardiac arrest. But Charles couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't really gone. Weeks later, he began hearing whispers. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder with each passing day. They called his name, taunted him, promised things he didn't want to believe. And then one morning he woke up to find a piece of paper on his desk. It was old, yellowed, with words scrawled in a language he didn't recognize. At the bottom, there was a blank line, waiting for his signature. The whispers grew louder. and Charles Keene realized, too late, that the devil always gets his due. Dr. Alan Hayes had seen his fair share of troubled minds during his 25 years as a psychiatrist. Veterans haunted by war, families torn apart by tragedy, even the occasional delusional zealot. But none of those cases prepared him for what awaited behind the locked doors of room 317 at St. Augustine Psychiatric Hospital. The call had come from a desperate mother. Her son, David Rourke, had been institutionalized after attacking a neighbor with a garden spade. David, a 19-year-old with no prior history of violence, had been found screaming in his backyard, covered in dirt and blood. When the police subdued him, all he would say was, "I was trying to dig him out before he got to me." Dr. Hayes agreed to evaluate David out of professional curiosity more than anything. Cases of sudden psychosis fascinated him. But as he approached room 317, a shiver crawled up his spine. The boy sat on the bed, his body tense and his eyes darting to every shadow. His hands, raw and scabbed, gripped the edge of the mattress as if he were trying to anchor himself to reality. "David," Dr. Hayes began, pulling up a chair, "I'm here to help you. Can you tell me what happened?" David's head snapped toward him. "It's not safe," he whispered. "Not here. Not anywhere." "What's not safe?" Hayes asked, keeping his voice calm. David leaned closer, his voice dropping. "The walls. They're watching, listening." "The walls?" David nodded frantically. "It started when we moved into the old house. At first it was just whispers. At night, in the corners. My mom thought it was rats or something, but then the voices got louder. They said things, horrible things. They told me what to do." Hayes frowned. "What did they tell you to do, David?" The boy's eyes welled with tears. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, but they wouldn't stop. They said if I didn't do it, they'd take her instead. My mom." Dr. Hayes felt a flicker of unease. He'd heard delusions before, grand conspiracies, voices from God, even alien abductions. But there was something different about David, something unsettling in the way he spoke, as if he truly believed every word. "David," Hayes said carefully, "these voices you're hearing, do you think they're real?" David's face twisted into a mask of terror. "You don't understand. They are real. They're inside the walls, waiting, watching." Before Hayes could press further, David bolted upright, his restraints creaking against the sudden movement. "They're here! They followed me!" The room seemed to grow colder. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows on the walls. "David, calm down," Hayes said, but his voice lacked conviction. David's scream cut through the air, high-pitched and raw. He thrashed against the bed, his head snapping back as if struck by an unseen force. The lights dimmed further, plunging the room into a twilight gloom. And then Hayes heard it, a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Words slithered through the air, guttural and ancient, like a language no human mouth was meant to speak. "Do you hear it now?" David sobbed, his voice breaking. Hayes froze. Logic screamed at him to dismiss it, to chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. But the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices filling the room, each one venomous and eager. The walls seemed to pulse, the paint cracking as if the very structure of the room rejected its occupants. Hayes stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What is this?" he murmured. David's laughter was a sharp, unhinged sound. "You can't stop it. You're already part of it." The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Hayes fumbled for his phone, activating the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing David's face, contorted in agony. And then Hayes saw them. Faces, pale, gaunt, and eyeless, pressing against the walls as if trying to break through. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering words that made Hayes' stomach churn. "Leave him alone!" Hayes shouted, his voice cracking. The faces turned toward him, their expressions unreadable. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. David's body convulsed, his back arching off the bed. When he finally went limp, the lights flickered back on. The faces were gone, the walls smooth and unblemished. David's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "Dr. Hayes," he rasped. Hayes leaned closer, his hands trembling. "David, are you okay?" David's lips curled into a faint smile. "He's coming for you next." David was transferred to another facility the next day, but Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't free of whatever had taken hold of the boy. The whispers followed him, faint at first but growing louder with each passing night, and then the dreams began. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of cracking walls echoing in his ears. He'd see the faces, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. One night, he woke to find words scrawled on his bedroom wall. "We see you." Hayes left St. Augustine shortly after. He moved to a new city, took a new job. But it didn't matter. The whispers found him wherever he went. And late at night, when the world was quiet, he could hear them inside the walls, waiting. It started with a referral from the courthouse, the kind that always made Dr. Joseph Garvey groan. He was a psychiatrist, not a magician, but the courts liked to believe that anyone could be fixed if you just threw enough therapy at them. The patient, Thomas Craig, was a 36-year-old mechanic accused of murdering his landlord in cold blood. The case had made headlines. Thomas had slit the old man's throat right there in the driveway, while shouting something about saving his soul. It wasn't the act itself that caught attention. It was the chilling detail that Thomas had been smiling through the entire attack. Dr. Garvey had read the reports and decided it was an open and shut case of psychosis, probably untreated schizophrenia or a severe personality disorder. But the minute Thomas walked into his office, Garvey knew he was wrong. Thomas was tall and wiry, his face pale and drawn. His hands were cuffed to his waist, a prison guard standing close behind him. What struck Garvey, though, wasn't the man's appearance. It was his eyes. They were hollow, like two black holes swallowing the light. "Good afternoon, Thomas," Garvey said, trying to keep his tone professional. Thomas didn't respond. He shuffled to the chair and sat, his gaze fixed somewhere just over Garvey's shoulder. "Let's start simple," Garvey continued, opening his notepad. "Can you tell me what happened with Mr. Lawson?" Thomas's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile appearing. "He wouldn't listen," he said, his voice soft but sharp, like a knife sliding through silk. "He didn't believe me when I told him who was inside." "Inside?" Thomas nodded. "The devil. He was wearing Lawson's skin like a cheap suit. You've seen it, haven't you? The way they pretend to be people." Garvey's pen hovered over the page. "You believe Mr. Lawson was possessed?" Thomas's smile widened, revealing teeth that were surprisingly white. "It's not what I believe. It's what I know. The devil told me himself. Said I had to stop him before he spread." "And the devil speaks to you directly?" "Not just speaks. He shows me things. Faces, places, things you wouldn't believe. He's been talking to me since I was a kid, whispering in my ear at night." The room seemed to grow colder. Garvey ignored the sensation, leaning forward slightly. "Thomas, have you ever been diagnosed with a mental health condition? Schizophrenia, perhaps?" Thomas's eyes locked onto Garvey's for the first time, and the intensity in them made the psychiatrist's throat tighten. "You think this is in my head," Thomas said, his tone almost pitying. "But you'll see. He'll come for you too." The words lingered in the air long after the session ended. That night, Garvey stayed late in his office, finishing paperwork. He told himself he wasn't unsettled by Thomas's words, but the truth clawed at the back of his mind. As he packed up to leave, he noticed something odd. The room was quiet. Too quiet. The hum of the air conditioner, the distant chatter of night staff, everything had disappeared. And then he heard it. A low whisper, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. He turned, scanning the room. "Hello?" The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural laugh that seemed to echo inside his skull. The lights flickered, plunging the office into brief darkness. When they came back, Garvey saw something that made his stomach drop. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like ash, were the words, "He sees you." The next morning, Garvey told himself it was a prank. Maybe one of the janitors had overheard the session and decided to mess with him. But the feeling of unease persisted as he met with Thomas again. This time, Thomas seemed more composed, almost smug. "Rough night, Doc?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Garvey hesitated. "Why do you ask?" Thomas leaned forward as far as his restraints would allow. "He showed you, didn't he? Just a little taste. He likes to play with his food." Garvey's pulse quickened. "Who showed me?" Thomas laughed. "You know who." The session devolved into incoherent ramblings, but one phrase stuck with Garvey. "He's in the cracks." Over the next week, the whispers grew more frequent. They followed Garvey home, invading his once quiet sanctuary. He saw shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. Objects in his house shifted positions when he wasn't looking. One night, he woke to find his reflection in the mirror smiling back at him, even though his own face was frozen in terror. Desperate for answers, Garvey returned to Thomas. "Tell me how to stop it," he demanded, abandoning all pretense of professionalism. Thomas grinned, his teeth looking sharper than before. "You don't stop him, you join him, or you run." "I can't run," Garvey snapped. "This is my life, my home." Thomas's grin faded, replaced by something darker. "Then you've already lost." That night, Garvey decided to confront the whispers head-on. Armed with nothing but a Bible he hadn't opened in years, he sat in his living room and waited. The house was silent at first, the kind of silence that pressed down on your chest. Then came the whispers, growing louder, more insistent. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into pitch black. Garvey clutched the Bible tighter, his hands trembling. "Show yourself," he shouted into the void. The laughter returned, and this time, it wasn't alone. Shadows coalesced in the corner of the room, forming a figure tall and impossibly thin. Its eyes glowed red, and its smile stretched unnaturally wide. "Dr. Garvey," it purred, its voice a symphony of torment. "You've been so much fun to watch. What do you want?" Garvey whispered. The creature leaned closer, its breath cold against his face. "To make you mine." The last thing Garvey saw before everything went dark was its hand reaching for his chest, fingers like knives. When they found him the next morning, Garvey was sitting in his chair, his eyes staring blankly ahead. The Bible lay open in his lap, its pages torn and burnt. He was alive, but he wouldn't speak. The only sound he made was a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. On the wall behind him, scrawled in ash, were the words, "He's in the cracks." Dr. Meredith Clark was no stranger to strange cases. She'd been practicing psychiatry for 20 years and thought she'd seen everything: schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, extreme psychosis. But nothing could have prepared her for Daniel Whitaker. Daniel wasn't a typical patient. He didn't arrive on his own volition, nor was he referred by any ordinary institution. Instead, he was delivered in the back of an unmarked van, flanked by 2 officers who wouldn't even meet her eyes. They dropped him off at her private office with a single warning: "Don't trust what he says. Don't trust what he doesn't say either." He was a gaunt, hollow man in his mid-30s with skin so pale it was almost translucent. His wrists were cuffed to his waist, and his eyes, God, those eyes, burned like dying embers. He didn't look at her as much as through her, as though her flesh and bones were just obstacles to something deeper. "Good evening, Daniel," she said, her voice steady. His lips curled into a faint smile, a gesture more predator than polite. "Dr. Clark, they told me about you." "Who told you about me?" she asked, pulling out her notepad. His grin widened. "You'll meet them soon enough." Meredith ignored the chill creeping up her spine and began her usual intake questions. Name, age, medical history. Daniel answered in short, clipped sentences, his tone dripping with a mix of mockery and indifference. But then she asked about the crime. "They say you killed your neighbor, Sarah White." She began cautiously. "Strangled her in her kitchen. Witnesses claimed you were speaking in a language no one understood." Daniel's eyes darkened. "I didn't kill her," he said softly. Meredith paused. "But witnesses saw—" "She wasn't Sarah anymore," he interrupted, his voice sharpening. "Not when it moved in." "It?" Daniel leaned forward, the chains clinking softly. He doesn't like being called that. He prefers names like Lucifer, or Abaddon, or sometimes just Sir. Meredith felt her throat tighten. "You're saying the devil possessed Sarah White?" Daniel chuckled, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong in his thin chest. "Not just her. He's always looking for new places to hide, new voices to borrow." His grin faltered. "He's tired of me, though. Says I'm worn out. Says he's got his eye on someone fresher." The way Daniel stared at her then made her skin crawl. That night, Meredith stayed late reviewing Daniel's file. The details were vague, almost intentionally so. No mention of a trial, no explanation of why he was being treated privately instead of at a state facility. The only consistent thread was the violence. Neighbors, friends, even his own brother. All dead, their bodies marked by the same eerie detail. Ash scattered around the crime scenes in shapes that defied explanation. She found herself rereading the description of Sarah White's death. Her body was cold, but her kitchen smelled of sulfur. Her eyes were burned black, though there was no fire. A faint whisper interrupted her thoughts. At first, she thought it was the wind outside, but as she strained to listen, she realized the sound was coming from inside the office. "Meredith?" Her blood ran cold. The voice was low and ragged, almost like the scrape of nails against a coffin lid. She whipped her head around, but the office was empty. Just as she convinced herself it was her imagination, the whisper came again. "He sees you." The lamp on her desk flickered. Her breath caught as shadows in the corner of the room seemed to ripple, twisting into something almost human. Then, as quickly as it began, the room fell silent. The next morning, Meredith confronted Daniel during their session. "Do you hear voices, Daniel?" she asked, trying to mask the tremor in her tone. "Only when he wants me to," Daniel replied, tilting his head like a curious child. "Why? Have they started talking to you?" "I'm not here to discuss me." Daniel laughed, loud and sharp, and it echoed unnaturally in the small room. "Oh, doctor, you're in this now. You think you're helping me, but you're just opening the door wider." "What door?" she demanded. "The one he uses to step through," Daniel whispered, leaning in close. His breath smelled like burnt wood. "You feel him, don't you? Watching, waiting?" Meredith tried to maintain her composure. "Daniel, these are symptoms of psychosis. Delusions, auditory hallucinations. With the right medication, do you think pills will stop him?" Daniel snapped, his voice suddenly filled with venom. "He's older than your god, doctor. He doesn't need me anymore because now he's inside you." Over the next week, the whispers became louder, more persistent. They followed her home, filling the empty spaces of her house with words she couldn't understand but instinctively feared. Objects moved on their own, books falling off shelves, lights flickering, doors creaking open. At night, she dreamed of fire and shadows, of a voice that called her name in the dark. One evening, she woke to find her bedroom mirror covered in ash. Scrawled across the surface were the words, "Let me in." Desperate, Meredith reached out to a priest, Father Callahan, who agreed to perform a blessing in her home. He arrived with a solemn expression, carrying a crucifix and a vial of holy water. As he began the prayer, the temperature in the room plummeted. The whispers returned, now a cacophony of voices, screaming and laughing. "Dr. Clark," Father Callahan gasped, his voice trembling. "What have you invited into this house?" Before she could answer, the crucifix flew from his hand, slamming against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. The room filled with the stench of sulfur as a shadowy figure emerged from the corner, its form writhing and shifting. "Meredith?" it hissed, its voice a blend of Daniel's and something far more sinister. "You should have stayed away." The last thing Meredith saw before the world went dark was the figure lunging toward her, its eyes blazing like hellfire. When her colleagues found her the next morning, she was sitting at her desk, her face pale and her eyes unfocused. On the wall behind her, written in ash, was a single word: Welcome. Dr. Julian Harper was not a religious man. He preferred the cold, clinical truths of science over faith, the tangibility of data over prayer. His work as a forensic psychiatrist had always been rooted in logic. Murderers, rapists, and arsonists, he had studied them all, dissecting their motives with the precision of a surgeon. Evil, in his mind, was just a human construct, a convenient label for mental illness and unchecked impulses. That was before he met Caleb Reeves. The meeting took place in the secure wing of a psychiatric facility just outside Dallas. Caleb, a slight man of 42, sat shackled to the bolted-down table in the middle of the observation room. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken pits of shadow. "I hear you're the best," Caleb said as Julian entered. His voice was low and gravelly, like he'd been gargling broken glass. Julian didn't respond immediately. He set his recorder on the table, opened his notepad, and took a seat across from the man. "I've been assigned to evaluate your mental state," Julian said, his tone professional but detached. Caleb smirked. "Oh, I can save you the trouble, Doc. I'm batshit crazy." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Are you?" "That's what they tell me," Caleb said, leaning forward as far as his restraints allowed. "Killed my wife. My 2 kids, too. Cops found me covered in blood, sitting in the living room like I was watching Sunday football." Julian had read the file. It was true. The murders had been brutal. Overkill didn't even begin to describe it. But what had puzzled investigators was Caleb's demeanor when they arrived. Calm, detached, almost amused. "And why did you do it?" Julian asked, clicking his pen. The smirk disappeared from Caleb's face, replaced by something colder. "I didn't. He did." Julian didn't flinch. He'd heard similar deflections before. "Who's he?" "You know who," Caleb whispered, his eyes locking onto Julian's. "The devil, Old Scratch, Beelzebub, whatever you want to call him." "Caleb," Julian began, keeping his tone steady. "You don't believe that. You're using it as an excuse to avoid responsibility." "I'm not avoiding anything," Caleb snapped, his voice rising to an almost inhuman pitch. "He was in me. He used my hands. I could feel him moving under my skin like worms." Julian took a slow breath, jotting down a few notes. Delusions of possession weren't uncommon in cases of extreme psychosis. "Tell me more about this possession," Julian said. Caleb's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You don't get it, do you? You think you're safe, sitting there with your clipboard, looking at me like I'm some puzzle you can solve. But he's in the room, Doc. He's watching you right now." Julian felt an involuntary chill run down his spine, but he brushed it off. That night, Julian stayed late at his office reviewing the recording of the session. Caleb's voice filled the room, distorted slightly by the old equipment. "He doesn't care about me anymore," Caleb was saying. "He's done with me. He likes fresh meat, someone with a clean soul. You've got one of those, don't you, Doc?" Julian paused the tape, frowning. There was a faint background noise, like a low growl, that hadn't been there during the session. He rewound the tape, listening again. "Clean soul. You got one of those, don't you, Doc?" Growl. Julian leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The rational part of his brain insisted it was just interference, but something about the sound gnawed at him. Then his office phone rang. He jumped, his heart hammering in his chest. With a shaky hand, he picked up the receiver. "Dr. Harper," he said. For a moment, there was only static on the other end. Then a voice, faint but unmistakable. "He's coming for you." Over the next week, Julian's life began to unravel. At first, it was small things. His office door creaking open when no one was there, lights flickering during sessions. But then the dreams started. In them, he was always in his childhood home, standing in the basement where his father used to store tools. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur, and shadows slithered along the walls like living things. In the corner of the room stood a figure, tall, with impossibly long limbs and eyes that burned like coals. It never moved, but Julian could feel its presence, oppressive and all-consuming. When he woke, his sheets were soaked with sweat, and his chest ached as if he'd been holding his breath for hours. Julian confronted Caleb during their next session. "What did you do to me?" he demanded, slamming his fists on the table. Caleb's smile was maddeningly serene. "I didn't do anything, Doc. You did this to yourself." "What are you talking about?" "You invited him in," Caleb said, his voice almost gentle. "You thought you could look into the abyss and walk away clean, but the abyss doesn't just stare back. It reaches out and pulls you in." Julian felt the room tilt, the fluorescent lights above flickering. "I don't believe in any of this," Julian said, though his voice wavered. Caleb leaned forward, his expression predatory. "You will." That night, Julian woke to find himself standing in the middle of his living room, barefoot and trembling. The TV was on, though he didn't remember turning it on. Static filled the screen, and within it, faint images of faces twisted in agony. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him from all sides. "He's here. He's here. He's here." Julian spun around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. Then the static on the TV cleared, and Caleb's face appeared on the screen. "Hello, Doc," Caleb said, his voice crackling through the speakers. "Enjoying the show?" Julian stumbled backward, his mind racing. "This isn't real," he muttered. "This isn't real." Caleb's face twisted into something monstrous, his eyes glowing red. "Oh, it's real, Julian, and it's just the beginning." The screen went black, leaving Julian alone in the suffocating silence. On the wall behind him, written in smeared ash, were the words, "See you soon." Dr. Richard Coleman had always considered himself a man of reason. A psychiatrist by profession, he spent his days unraveling the minds of his patients, exploring the complexities of their fears and desires. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything supernatural. He only believed in what he could see, what he could measure, and what he could understand. The human mind was a labyrinth, but one that could be mapped, categorized, and fixed. Then he met Thomas Archer. It was a late afternoon when Richard first heard about Thomas. He had just finished his last patient for the day, a woman named Linda, who suffered from severe anxiety. She always seemed to leave his office in a better state than when she arrived. But this new case, the one about Thomas, was different. He'd been brought in by the police after a violent outburst at his home. His wife and 2 children found alive but traumatized, unable to speak about what had happened. The officer said Thomas had been acting strange. They were worried he might be dangerous. Richard's curiosity piqued. He agreed to meet the man the following morning. The small psychiatric facility where Richard worked had always been quiet. Its walls were adorned with soft blues and whites, designed to soothe the most disturbed minds. Thomas, however, sat in the starkest room. White walls, white chair, white table. No distractions, no comforts. When Richard walked in, he was struck by the sheer stillness of the man. Thomas didn't seem agitated, but he didn't seem fully aware either. His eyes were glassy, distant, as if he were looking through Richard, not at him. "Mr. Archer." Richard's voice was professional, calm. Thomas's head jerked, as though waking from a deep sleep. He turned his eyes toward Richard, his gaze piercing. "You're here to fix me, right?" Richard sat down across from him, adjusting his glasses. "I'm here to help you understand what happened, Thomas. To help you." Thomas let out a hollow laugh, a sound that sent a chill through Richard's bones. "Help? You can't help me, doctor. No one can help me." Richard frowned, taking out his notepad. "I'm here to listen. I need you to tell me what happened." Thomas's smile faded into something darker. "I'll tell you everything, Doc, but you won't believe me. No one does." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Try me." Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I didn't hurt my family. It wasn't me. It was him." Richard waited for more, but Thomas fell silent. After a moment, Richard prompted, "Who?" "The devil," Thomas said flatly, as if the answer were obvious. "He came to me that night. He said he was going to make me do things I wouldn't be able to stop. And I couldn't. I couldn't stop him, Dr. Coleman. Richard shifted in his seat, his skepticism creeping in. Thomas, I know this is hard to understand, but mental illness can make people believe things that aren't real. I need to understand what's going on in your mind. Thomas shook his head, his eyes narrowing with a maddening intensity. You don't get it. He made me do things. He is me. I'm not in control anymore. Richard's mind raced. This was a classic case of dissociation, delusion, maybe even schizophrenia. He had seen it all before. But Thomas's eyes, wide and unfocused, unsettled him. The man wasn't lying, but Richard knew it wasn't the truth, not in the way Thomas thought it was. I need you to explain, Richard said, trying to regain his composure. Tell me exactly what happened. Thomas's voice became low, almost a growl. It was the night of the storm. I remember it clearly. The lights flickered, the wind howled, and then he was there, standing in the doorway of our bedroom. Tall, so tall. His face was... Thomas paused, shuddering. It was a face of nightmares, a mouth that never stopped moving, teeth like knives. He told me that I was his, that he had waited for me. And when he spoke, it wasn't in words. It was a feeling that wormed its way into my chest and took root. Richard leaned forward slightly, trying to make sense of it. What do you mean, a feeling? I couldn't resist him, Thomas whispered. He made me do things, made me hurt them. He said it was for a greater purpose, that I had to do it. He said I had to cleanse them. My wife, my kids. They were his too, but I didn't know it until it was too late. Thomas's voice cracked. His hands trembled as they gripped the edges of his chair. When I woke up, I was covered in blood. They were still alive, but they didn't speak. They wouldn't speak. I couldn't remember what happened, but he told me everything, told me how to explain it, told me to tell the cops that I didn't remember anything, that I was just sick. But I know the truth. I know he was inside me. Richard's pen stopped moving, his mind swimming with the implications. This wasn't a typical case. This was something else. Tell me about the devil, Richard said, though part of him wanted to pull away from the conversation. What did he look like? Thomas's eyes went wide, his pupils dilating. He was the size of a man, but twisted. His skin wasn't like ours. It was black, like burnt wood. And his eyes, God, his eyes, were nothing but fire. He told me that I was his instrument, that I had been chosen, and that I would do this again. I will do it again. Richard's stomach churned, but he forced himself to maintain composure. He had heard cases of religious delusion before, but never like this. Something felt wrong, something far beyond just a mental illness. Before Richard could ask more, the door to the room swung open, and one of the orderlies stepped in, his face pale. Doctor, you need to see this. Richard stood up, his heart pounding. What is it? The security cameras, the orderly said, voice shaking. You need to see the footage. The footage showed Thomas in his room later that night, after their session had ended. He sat motionless in the center of the room, his eyes wide open, and then, for no reason, his body jerked violently. His arms flailed as if they weren't his own. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and a shadow seemed to crawl from his skin, a dark, formless shape that writhed on the video. The shadow swirled, coiling around Thomas's body, and for a moment, the figure seemed to split, like something was tearing through the fabric of reality itself. Then it was gone. Thomas slumped forward, breathing heavily, his eyes vacant. The camera turned back to normal. Richard's hands trembled as he watched the footage. He had never believed in the supernatural, never thought to entertain such thoughts. But now he wasn't so sure. He turned to the orderly, his voice barely a whisper. Get the police. Get everyone. I'm not going in there again. But it was too late. The shadow had already started to move. And this time, it wasn't just Thomas it was after. It was Richard. Dr. Samuel Graves had been practicing psychiatry for over 20 years. He had seen the full spectrum of human suffering: depression, anxiety, psychosis, and trauma. He was a man of science, a man who believed in medication and therapy, in the power of the mind to heal itself when given the right tools. But everything changed the day he met Eva Marsh. Eva was referred to Dr. Graves after a series of bizarre, violent incidents at her home. Her husband, a local attorney, was beside himself. He insisted that Eva had become someone else, someone violent, cruel, and erratic. They had been married for 10 years, and he had never seen her like this. Eva's behavior had shifted so drastically that her children were afraid of her. She was no longer the loving mother they had known. The woman who had once baked cookies with them on weekends now screamed at them for no reason, her eyes black with fury. And worse yet, sometimes her voice would change, low, guttural, unrecognizable. The first time Dr. Graves laid eyes on Eva, she sat in front of him in his office, hands folded neatly in her lap, a blank expression on her face. She looked so normal, but something about her eyes unsettled him. There was a coldness there, a distance that seemed unnatural. Dr. Graves pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the symptoms her husband had described. "Tell me, Eva," he began gently, "what's been happening at home?" Eva blinked slowly, as if she hadn't quite heard him, before her lips curved into a faint, unsettling smile. "You want to know what's happening at home, doctor? I'll tell you," she said, her voice suddenly slipping into something much darker, lower. "It's him. He's here. He's always been here." Dr. Graves's heart skipped a beat. He had heard patients speak about their delusions before, but this felt different. Eva didn't sound like someone who was hallucinating. She sounded certain, like she knew something he didn't. "Who's here, Eva?" Dr. Graves asked, maintaining his professional tone. Eva's smile widened, her eyes glinting with something otherworldly. "The devil," she whispered. "He's inside me." Dr. Graves was silent for a moment. He had dealt with patients who had spoken of God, angels, and demons, but he had always written it off as religious delusion, a symptom of a deeper psychiatric issue. Still, there was something in Eva's voice that made him hesitate. "Do you mean that metaphorically?" he asked, his voice a little tighter now. "Is this a feeling you're having, or—" Eva shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "No, doctor. He's real, and he's inside me. He tells me things. Terrible things." Dr. Graves leaned forward slightly, now more intrigued than ever. "What does he tell you, Eva?" Eva's smile turned into a twisted grin. "He tells me to hurt people, to make them pay for their sins. He says I'm the chosen one, the one who will bring about his kingdom." Dr. Graves felt a chill run down his spine. "Has he told you to hurt anyone yet?" Eva's fingers twitched. "Not yet, but he's getting impatient. He wants me to start. Soon." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if the walls were closing in. Dr. Graves could feel the weight of Eva's words pressing against him. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Eva," he said, his voice firm, "I want you to understand something. This is not the devil. This is your mind playing tricks on you. You're not possessed. You're sick. You're having a psychotic episode, and I can help you." Eva tilted her head as if considering his words. Then she said very softly, "You don't understand, Dr. Graves. You don't understand what he can do." The room fell silent. Dr. Graves could feel his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Eva, I'm a doctor. I understand mental illness better than anyone. I can help you." But Eva's smile was back, and it was cold. "You can't help me," she said. "You can't stop him. No one can." Dr. Graves stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I think it's time for us to finish today's session. I want you to think about what we've talked about. I'll see you again next week." Eva's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, her eyes following him as he left the room. But as Dr. Graves stepped into the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong. That night, Dr. Graves couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Eva's words, about the way she spoke of the devil as though she truly believed it. He found himself pacing in his living room, trying to push the thoughts away, but they lingered. Her eyes, that smile, there was something so unsettling about her. He had dealt with many patients in his career, but none like her. And the more he thought about her, the more he began to question whether she was really sick, or if there was something far darker at work. He had always prided himself on being logical, rational. But for the first time, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out of his control. The following day, Dr. Graves arrived at his office early, hoping to clear his mind. As he walked through the quiet halls, something caught his eye, a small handwritten note pinned to the bulletin board near the nurse's station. It was a note from one of his colleagues. "Dr. Graves, I'm sorry to inform you, but we've had to transfer Eva Marsh to another facility. She was found dead this morning. Her husband claims she was different in the last few days. We're not sure what happened." Dr. Graves froze, the blood draining from his face. He couldn't understand. He had just seen Eva yesterday. How could she? His mind raced as he walked to his office, the note still in his hand. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. As he reached for the phone to call her husband, the lights flickered, plunging the office into darkness. And that's when he heard it. A voice, low and guttural, coming from behind him. "You thought you could fix her, Dr. Graves. But I am in control now. You're next." Dr. Graves turned slowly, but there was no one there. The voice continued, echoing through the dark office. "You're the one who doesn't understand." And for the first time in his life, Dr. Graves felt a wave of cold terror flood over him, because he knew with a sickening certainty that Eva had been right. The devil wasn't just inside her. The devil was inside all of them now. I had always been a skeptic, a man of reason, of science. My name is Dr. Alexander Reed, and for 15 years I have worked as a psychiatrist in the small town of Ashford. In all that time, I treated everything from severe anxiety to manic depression, but never did I expect to face the horror that came into my office one late autumn afternoon. Her name was Claire Bishop, and when she walked through my door, I could feel the temperature drop in the room. It wasn't just the air conditioner, it was something more, a presence. And I had learned long ago that if you didn't listen to that feeling, you were asking for trouble. Claire sat across from me in silence. Her eyes were wide, frantic, and there was something about them that seemed to reach through me. It's hard to explain, but when someone looks at you like that, like they can see your very soul, it's a weight that sinks deep into your chest. But she was only a patient, I reminded myself. A human being in need of help, and I was here to provide it. "So, Claire," I said, my voice calm, professional, "what brings you here today?" She didn't speak for a long time, just stared at me. I let the silence linger. Sometimes that's the best way to get someone to open up. But when she finally did speak, her voice was like the scratch of nails on a chalkboard. "It's in the mirror," she said. Her voice wasn't just odd, it was wrong, like it didn't belong to her. "He's watching me. I can see him behind me. Always." I raised an eyebrow. "Who's in the mirror, Claire?" She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were darker, as if the light had drained from them entirely. "The man, the one who tells me what to do." A chill ran down my spine. I'd heard plenty of delusions in my time. People talking about voices, hallucinations, and things that weren't real. But this felt different. This felt wrong. "Tell me more about the man," I urged, trying to keep my voice steady. "What does he say?" Claire's hands clenched into fists in her lap. "He tells me I have to let him in, that I need to invite him. He says I'm the only one who can bring him into this world." I had seen cases of dissociative identity disorder before, patients convinced they were someone else, or even something else. But this was something darker, something far more sinister. "Claire," I said, leaning forward. "I'm not sure I understand. Who is this man?" She laughed, a laugh that made my skin crawl. It wasn't her voice anymore. It was low, guttural, almost growling. "You don't get it, do you, Dr. Reed? You really don't understand who I am." The room seemed to shift, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones. I had to remind myself to breathe. I had been through many sessions in my career, but nothing had prepared me for what was happening now. "Claire, this isn't you talking," I said, trying to steady my nerves. "This is part of the illness. We can work through this." Her head tilted, and she smiled at me. A smile that wasn't hers, stretching too wide, too cruel. "Oh, I am talking, Dr. Reed, and soon you'll understand. You'll help me bring him here." And then, it happened. Claire's body jerked violently, as if something inside her had suddenly taken control. Her neck snapped at an unnatural angle, her eyes bulging, mouth contorting into a scream that was too inhuman to be real. But it was real. I could hear it, feel it. It rattled my very soul. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the phone on my desk, but when I looked up, she was still smiling at me. Her body, however, was different. The very air in the room seemed to pulse, to thrum with something ancient, something evil. Her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was the man's. "Doctor Reed, I told you. He's here. He's inside me now. He's been waiting for you." And then the lights flickered. The room felt like it was closing in. And for the first time in my life, I realized I was completely, utterly powerless. I was staring into something I had no way of understanding. Something that shouldn't exist in the realm of science or reason. But it was there. I could feel it, like a weight on my chest, a presence that made it hard to breathe. What do you want from me?" I gasped, barely able to form the words. The man's voice chuckled, low and guttural. "I don't want anything from you, Dr. Reed. I want you to help me finish what Claire started. You're the key. You always have been." The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air thicker, and I felt my knees weaken. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, crawling toward me like hands reaching out to drag me into the darkness. And there, in the corner of the room, was the mirror, no longer reflecting just Claire, but a figure behind her, tall and distorted, a grin that didn't belong in this world. "You know me, Dr. Reed," the man whispered. "You've always known me. You've seen me before." I staggered backward, knocking over my chair. No, I haven't. I don't know you." "Oh, but you do," he hissed. "You saw me. In your dreams. In your reflection. You've always known who I am." The mirror, my reflection, shifted. It wasn't me staring back anymore. It was a twisted version of myself. A version that smiled back at me with eyes as dark as the void. "I am the man in the mirror," the voice whispered. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the suffocating weight of fear and the knowledge that something had broken, something had changed, and the thing in the mirror was me. The authorities found me hours later, huddled in the corner of my office, muttering incoherently. Claire Bishop was gone. There was no sign of her in the office. No trace of the man she spoke of. Just a shattered mirror, the pieces scattered across the floor like broken dreams. They say I was just another victim of a psychotic break. A doctor who lost his mind. But they don't understand. They don't know what I saw, what I felt. I know now. What Claire said was true. The devil didn't need to possess her. He already had me.